We've been joined by two guests. Let me introduce them to you one by one. In the studios, we've been joined by Rear Admiral Javed Iqbal, who is, of course, the President of National Institute of Maritime Affairs. Thank you very much, sir, to have joined us. And online, we have been joined by Professor Dr. Shabnam Dilfani, who's a Deputy Editor of the London Post. Dr. Shabnam, thank you very much to have joined us as well. We'll begin with you, Rear Admiral Javed Iqbal Saab. I'd like to understand, Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, which carries around 20% of the oil trade of the entire globe. Now, from a naval strategic perspective, how feasible is such a closure in the short and the long term, and what would it mean for global energy security?
Thank you, Umar Saab, for having me. I think Hormuz, whenever you talk about it, especially in a warfare scenario, it figures out as the most strategic artery for the flow of the world energy, oil, that is oil, LNG, gas, etc. Because as you mentioned, 20% of the supplies pass through it. That amounts to around 21 million barrels per day. Now, that means that if there are interruptions to that, it sends a shock in the short-term scenario, and especially if it prolongs, then one of the international commentators said that it will be epochal because it has never been done before. The Hormuz has never been blockaded in that sense which it is being contemplated.
Of course, we are seeing that in real time as well. All right. So also, the United States indicates that it may deploy the Navy to escort tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. In your point of view, could this lead to some kind of a direct naval confrontation between the United States forces and Iran?
Yes, I think timing is very important because the escorting has been done before. If you recall the tanker war in which Iran and Iraq were fighting each other and they were targeting the merchant ships, because as the ships were supporting the respective economies. So the United States had to step in towards the end, closing days of the tanker war in 1987, and it reflagged the Kuwaiti oil tankers as American tankers, and then it escorted them. There were about 11 Kuwaiti tankers which were escorted, but that was 1987, and this is 2026. And the U.S. was not directly at war with Iran then, as is the scenario now. So saying about escorting is one thing, but doing would be very, very difficult. And timing, like I said, will be very important, that when they will contemplate it. Because consider one live wild card, because currently the United States has said that they are going to annihilate the Iranian Navy, they are going to demolish their missile industry infrastructure and the missiles. But what about naval mines? Because naval mines, it is said that they are poor man's nuclear weapon. So Iran had mined the Persian Gulf and Hormuz in the tanker war, but that was minuscule as compared to what the capability might have improved today. And for the United States to engage into that kind of transit in this scenario would be very, very challenging, I must say.
All right. It's going to be a challenging scenario for the U.S., but Washington claims that it has nearly struck around 2,000 targets across Iran and has destroyed several naval assets as well. From a military point of view, can these strikes significantly weaken Iran's deterrence capacity or capability?
Of course, sir. As you've said, there's an extensive military campaign going on, and targeting is being done around the coastal installations and the deep inside. The missile manufacturing infrastructure is being targeted. That will, to some extent, weaken the deterrence, the capacity of the Iran to resist the United States and Israeli onslaught. But look at the Iranian coastline, which straddles the Persian Gulf. It is very long coastline, and along the coastline, Iran has developed an asymmetric warfare capability, in which Iran doesn't have a functioning air force. It has a semblance of a navy, but its IRGC navy is very, very strong, which comprises of very small but fast attack boats, which can speed, swarm, and attack merchant ships, and also the naval vessels. To target and take out that kind of capability, which is diffused all along the Iranian coastline, will be very, very difficult scenario. All right. I must say.
All right. We've also, Rear Admiral Iqbal Saab, Iran Israel rather says that Iran still retains significant missile launch capability despite heavy bombardment that is continuing, in fact, every passing day. Does this suggest, in your point of view, that this very conflict can now turn into a prolonged missile war across the region?
It is hard to say at this time because it would depend upon the residual inventories, which I guess must be depleting very, very fast. And it is both ways on the Iranian side as well as the interceptors, missile interceptors, which are deployed in the Gulf countries at US bases. So it is hard to say, but you cannot rule out because I said like the residual capacities of the missiles, will continue to figure out as we proceed ahead.
All right. Sir, President Trump hints, and he has hinted, and a lot of media channels and outlets have highlighted this very fact, the fact that President Trump says that he does not rule out boots on the ground. Now, realistically, in your point of view, how feasible would a ground campaign be inside Iran's mountainous terrain for any external military power, in this case, the US?
Wow, the ground campaign question, it is a big, million-dollar question that whether would it be possible inside Iran, because consider, the operations, US operations against Iraq, and a big amphibious landing was planned and then it was conducted, and how the Iraq Republican Guards collapsed suddenly, and it was preceded by a shock and awe campaign. We have seen the targeting being done inside Iran, but probably the objectives were not articulated like that. Although they said, the Defense Secretary, the President Trump said that, nothing can be ruled out and we are not going to disclose our plans as such. But, given the objectives that were otherwise articulated, destruction of the Navy, destruction of the missile industry, and the destruction of the missiles capability, and the regime change, which, de facto has taken place, but not, in actual. So I don't see any kind of ground campaign in immediate time frame, but we will see how the scenario unfolds.
Of course, the scenario is unfolding with every passing day, and as Donald Trump says, this is a conflict that might continue to 4 weeks or even beyond. Well, Rear Admiral Javed Iqbal Saab, Iranian retaliation has expanded to targets, as Professor Shabnam was also saying, to targets in the Gulf, including ports and infrastructure in countries such as the UAE, Oman and others. Does this indicate, in your point of view, that the conflict is moving towards some kind of a wider regional maritime and energy war?
Definitely, I would say so. You must know that today in the early morning, an Iranian Navy ship was targeted off the coast of Sri Lanka as it was returning from India after attending a military exercise. So that is certainly on the cards because they have targeted the Iranian Navy big ships, but as I said, the fast attack craft, they have the capability. What about Iranian submarines? Iran has been maintaining a submarine capability, the larger kilo class submarines, which are old, but it has an inventory of very small, agile, and small submarines which are capable to operate in the shallow waters and wait and seek and undertake targeting of high-value targets, as it has been alluded that United States Navy might escort. And you would also recall that in the tanker war, when the Hormuz and Persian Gulf was mined, 2 US Navy ships, struck mines and underwent significant degradation and suffered damage and casualties also. So in that kind of scenario, and what if Iran resorts to guerre de coup? It's a French term, which is loosely translated as economic warfare. What if it starts targeting merchant ships, which currently, a number of couple of hundred of merchant ships are blockaded inside Hormuz currently. Many of them are loaded with oil. Imagine the catastrophe if an oil tankers are targeted inside the Gulf. What about if the LNG carriers, are targeted? As you might know that an LNG carrier, if targeted and if it explodes, it is almost, just like a tactical nuclear explosion, So the maritime scenario is very, very scary if, Iran comes to that sort of tactics as a last resort.
Of course, and it is scary. Let's hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah,
That's
sure.
all we can hope and pray. Dr.